I'm Sarah Mitchell, 29, and I just became the landlord of the company that fired me for asking for a raise. When they called to complain about their new lease terms, I didn't even bother picking up. The same HR director who told me to know my place was now leaving desperate voicemails about how they couldn't afford the rent increase. The irony was absolutely delicious. And honestly, I was just getting started. Before we go deeper, please click the subscribe button and comment down below where you are watching from. Let me take you back to where this all began, because revenge stories like this don't happen overnight. They're built brick by brick, fueled by every condescending comment and dismissive gesture that chips away at your dignity until something inside you snaps and rebuilds itself into something much more dangerous. I had been working at Meridian Marketing Solutions for 3.5 years when I finally decided to ask for that raise. 3.5 years of arriving early, staying late, and watching mediocre men get promoted over me while I was told I was doing great but needed to be patient. The company was thriving, partly because of campaigns I had developed, partly because I had single-handedly saved 2 major client relationships when other account managers had fumbled them. My portfolio was solid, my results were measurable, and my confidence was finally strong enough to walk into that meeting. The office was one of those generic corporate spaces with gray carpet, fluorescent lighting, and motivational posters that felt more like threats than inspiration. I had practiced my pitch in the mirror that morning, rehearsed the numbers, prepared for every possible objection. I knew I deserved a 20% increase, but I was prepared to negotiate down to 15%. What I wasn't prepared for was the patronizing smile that spread across HR Director Brad Hoffman's face when I finished my presentation. Brad was the kind of middle-aged man who wore polo shirts to the office and called everyone sport or champ, while somehow making it sound insulting. He had thinning hair that he styled with too much gel and a habit of leaning back in his chair like he owned the world. When I finished explaining my contributions and market research on comparable salaries, he actually chuckled. Sarah, he said, shaking his head like I was a child who had just asked if I could stay up past bedtime. I appreciate your enthusiasm, I really do, but you need to be realistic about where you are in your career. You're still learning, still growing, and frankly, asking for this kind of increase shows me that you might not understand your position here. I felt my stomach drop, but I pressed on. Brad, I've increased client retention by 32% in my division. The Morrison campaign alone brought in $400,000 in new business, and the client specifically requested to work with me again. He waved his hand dismissively. Team effort, sport. You can't take credit for everything. Look, I get it. Everyone wants more money, but you need to know your place in this organization. We value you, don't get me wrong, but ambition without perspective can be dangerous. The phrase, know your place, hit me like a physical blow. Not because it hurt my feelings, though it certainly did, but because it revealed exactly what they thought of me. Despite everything I had accomplished, despite the late nights and the successful campaigns and the clients who asked for me by name, I was still just someone who needed to know her place. What exactly do you mean by that? I asked, my voice carefully controlled. I mean you're getting ahead of yourself. Look around this office, Sarah. See the people in leadership positions? They've paid their dues. They've proven themselves over years, not months. You're 29 years old. You've been here 3 years, and you're acting like you're ready to run the show. The meeting continued for another 10 minutes, but I stopped listening after that. Brad's words became background noise, while I sat there realizing that no amount of hard work, no number of successful campaigns, no level of measurable results would matter to people like him. I was a 29-year-old woman who had forgotten her place, and that was unforgivable. I walked out of that meeting with my head held high and my resolve crystallizing into something sharp and focused. That afternoon, I started updating my resume. Not because I was planning to find another job, but because I wanted to document exactly what I had accomplished at Meridian before they tried to rewrite history. The firing came 2 weeks later, and it was almost comically predictable in its execution. Brad called me into his office on a Friday afternoon, accompanied by Janet from HR, a nervous woman who always looked like she was apologizing for existing. They had prepared a script, obviously, because Brad's usual casual arrogance was replaced by corporate-speak formality. "Sarah, we've been evaluating team dynamics and performance metrics, and we've decided to make some structural changes," he began, not quite meeting my eyes. "Unfortunately, your position is being eliminated as part of our organizational restructuring." I almost laughed. "My position is being eliminated?" "That's correct. We'll be redistributing your responsibilities among the existing team members. The same responsibilities you just told me weren't significant enough to warrant a raise?" Janet shifted uncomfortably, but Brad's expression hardened. "This isn't about the raise, Sarah. This is about fit, cultural fit, team dynamics, long-term strategic planning. Sometimes people just aren't the right match for where a company is headed." They offered me 2 weeks of severance pay and a neutral reference letter. I signed their documents without argument, cleaned out my desk while my former colleagues avoided eye contact, and walked out of Meridian Marketing Solutions for what they assumed was the last time. What they didn't know was that I had been building something on the side for the past 18 months. Not another marketing company, not a competing business, but a cryptocurrency portfolio that had grown from a $5,000 investment into something approaching 7 figures. I had started buying Bitcoin and Ethereum in early 2022, back when everyone thought crypto was either a scam or a fad. I had researched blockchain technology, studied market patterns, and made careful, calculated investments while my colleagues were spending their money on overpriced lattes and weekend trips. The portfolio had been my safety net, my backup plan, my someday fund for starting my own business or taking a sabbatical or maybe buying a house. I checked it obsessively, watching the numbers climb and fall and climb again, always with the knowledge that this money represented freedom. I just hadn't expected to need that freedom quite so soon. The weekend after I was fired, I sat in my 1-bedroom apartment with my laptop open, staring at numbers that still didn't feel real. $1.4 million. Not enough to retire forever, but definitely enough to make some very interesting moves. I had been planning to hold for at least another year, but circumstances had changed, and sometimes you have to adapt your timeline to match opportunity. I started researching commercial real estate in our area, specifically focusing on older buildings that might house small to medium-sized businesses. It wasn't revenge planning. Not yet. It was just curiosity, just a way to channel my restless energy into something productive. But when I found the listing for 4047 Commerce Street, everything clicked into place. The building was a 1970s construction, 3 stories of bland brick and tinted windows that housed 4 different businesses. The ground floor was split between a dental practice and a small accounting firm. The second floor housed an insurance agency that had been there for 15 years. And the third floor, occupying the entire top level, was home to Meridian Marketing Solutions. The asking price was $2.1 million, which was steep but not impossible. The building needed some updates, the roof would require attention in the next few years, and the HVAC system was original to the construction. But the location was prime, the other tenants were established and stable, and most importantly, Meridian's lease was up for renewal in 6 months. I spent the next week doing due diligence that would have impressed my former colleagues if they had known about it. I researched the property history, the neighborhood development plans, the comparable sales in the area. I contacted a real estate attorney, a property inspector, and a commercial lending specialist. I set up an LLC called Cornerstone Property Holdings and opened a business bank account. I moved carefully and quietly, using professional services that prioritized discretion. The seller was an elderly man named Robert Chen, who had inherited the building from his father and was ready to cash out for retirement. He seemed surprised that someone my age was making such a substantial offer. But when my financing came through without complications, he stopped asking questions. The closing took place on a Tuesday morning in a lawyer's office that smelled like leather and old coffee. I signed my name approximately 47 times and walked out as the owner of a $2 million piece of commercial real estate. For the first month, I didn't make any changes. I let my property management company handle the day-to-day operations while I learned the rhythms of being a landlord. The dental practice was run by Dr. Sarah Kim, a woman about my age who had built a successful practice through word of mouth and patient care. The accounting firm was managed by Tom and Lisa Rodriguez, a married couple who had been serving local small businesses for 12 years. The insurance agency was owned by Margaret Walsh, a 60-something former corporate executive who had bought the business when the previous owner retired. And then there was Meridian, occupying the prime top-floor space with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the downtown skyline. They had been there for 8 years. Their lease was below market rate, and they were about to discover that their comfortable arrangement was about to change dramatically. I waited until their lease had 30 days remaining before I sent the renewal offer. Not because I was required to give that much notice, but because I wanted them to feel the pressure of time running out. The new lease terms were fair by current market standards, which meant they represented a 60% increase over what Meridian had been paying. The call came on a Thursday afternoon. My phone rang while I was reviewing financial reports for my other properties. Yes, I had started acquiring more, and Brad Hoffman's name appeared on my screen. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to his message while eating lunch. Sarah, this is Brad Hoffman from Meridian Marketing. I think there's been some kind of mistake with our lease renewal. The terms are completely unreasonable. And frankly, I'm not sure what kind of game is being played here. Give me a call back so we can sort this out like adults. The condescension was still there, even when he was the one asking for help. I deleted the message and went back to my reports. He called again the next day, and the day after that. By the 4th call, his tone had shifted from annoyed to concerned. By the 7th call, he was starting to sound desperate. I saved every voicemail not because I needed evidence of anything, but because I enjoyed listening to the progression of his panic. On the following Monday, I received a certified letter from Meridian's lawyer. The letter questioned the validity of the lease terms, suggested that the increase might constitute harassment, and demanded a meeting to discuss reasonable accommodations for a long-term tenant. I forwarded the letter to my own attorney, who confirmed what I already knew. Everything I was doing was completely legal. The meeting took place in a conference room at my lawyer's office. I arrived 15 minutes early and spent the time reviewing my notes and checking my appearance in the bathroom mirror. I had chosen my outfit carefully, a navy blue suit that was professional but not overly formal, minimal jewelry, and the kind of understated confidence that comes from holding all the cards. Brad walked in with Janet from HR and a lawyer whose name I didn't catch. The look on his face when he saw me sitting at the conference table was worth every penny I had invested in this building. Confusion, recognition, disbelief, and finally, the dawning realization that the young woman he had dismissed as overly ambitious was now in a position to determine his company's future. "Well," he said after a long pause, "this is unexpected." "Hello, Brad," I replied, keeping my voice level and professional. "Thank you for coming." He sat down heavily, his usual swagger replaced by the kind of wariness you see in animals who suddenly realize they're no longer the predator. "Sarah, I have to ask, what exactly is going on here? How are you involved in this property situation?" "I'm not involved in the situation, Brad. I am the situation. Cornerstone Property Holdings is my company, which means I'm your new landlord." The silence that followed was beautiful. Brad's lawyer leaned over to whisper something in his ear, but he barely seemed to hear it. He was staring at me with the expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle that didn't make sense. "This is some kind of joke, right?" he finally said. "You're 29 years old. You were working in account management 6 months ago. You can't possibly own this building." "I'm 30 now, actually. My birthday was last month. And you're right. 6 months ago I was working in account management, saving your Morrison-client relationship and developing campaigns that brought in nearly $500,000 in new business. But things change, don't they? My lawyer," a sharp woman named Patricia Reeves who specialized in commercial real estate, spread the relevant documents across the table. "Ms. Mitchell is the sole owner of Cornerstone Property Holdings, which acquired this property through a standard commercial transaction. The lease terms being offered to Meridian are consistent with current market rates. For comparable space..." Brad's lawyer reviewed the papers while Brad continued to stare at me like I was some kind of optical illusion. "Where did you get the money for this?" he asked. "That's not really relevant to our lease negotiation, is it?" I replied. "What matters is that Meridian's current lease expires in 3 weeks, and you need to decide whether you want to accept the new terms or find alternative accommodations." "Sarah, come on," he said, leaning forward with the kind of forced intimacy that had always made my skin crawl. "We can work something out here. Maybe we got off on the wrong foot before, but that doesn't mean we can't be reasonable adults about this business situation." "I am being reasonable, Brad. The lease terms I'm offering are actually below market rate for a space of this quality and location. I checked the comparables thoroughly before setting the price." "A 60% increase isn't reasonable by any standard," Janet finally spoke up. "We've been good tenants for 8 years. That should count for something." "It does count for something," I agreed. "It counts for the fact that you've been paying below market rent for most of those 8 years, which means you've had the benefit of substantial savings. Now those savings are ending, and you're paying what the space is actually worth." The meeting continued for another hour, with Brad's lawyer trying various legal approaches, and Brad himself alternating between disbelief and barely contained anger. They asked for time to consider the offer, which I granted. They asked for a payment plan to ease the transition, which I declined. They asked if there was any way to negotiate the terms, which I answered by pointing out that negotiation typically required both parties to have something the other wanted. As we were packing up to leave, Brad made one final attempt at connection. "Sarah, I want you to know that I respect what you've accomplished here. This is impressive, it really is. But I hope you're not doing this just to get back at us. That would be petty." I looked at him for a long moment, this man who had told me to know my place, who had fired me for being too ambitious, who was now sitting in my lawyer's conference room asking for mercy from the woman he had dismissed. "Brad," I said, "I want you to understand something. This isn't about getting back at you. This is about business. You taught me that sometimes people aren't the right fit for where a company is headed. And sometimes structural changes are necessary. I learned that lesson very well. They signed the lease 3 days before their deadline. They didn't have a choice, really. Moving a marketing agency with their client base and equipment requirements would have cost them more than accepting my terms, and office space in their preferred area was limited and expensive. The first month's rent payment arrived via wire transfer on the 1st of October, accompanied by a terse email from their accounting department. I deposited the money and used a portion of it to upgrade the building's internet infrastructure, install energy-efficient lighting, and update the common area landscaping, improvements that would benefit all tenants and increase the property's long-term value. Word spread quickly through the local business community about what had happened. The story evolved as it passed from person to person, gaining details and dramatic flourishes that hadn't actually occurred, that the basic facts remained consistent. A young woman had been fired for asking for a raise and had returned as her former employer's landlord. Some people thought it was brilliant. Others thought it was vindictive. A few suggested it was somehow unfair, though they couldn't articulate exactly what rules I had broken. The reactions told me more about the people offering them than about my own actions. Dr. Kim from the dental practice stopped by my office one afternoon to introduce herself properly. "I heard about what happened with the folks upstairs," she said with a smile. "I have to say, I admire your style. Not many people have the resources or the nerve to pull off something like that." "It wasn't about nerve," I told her. "It was about opportunity. When you have the means to make strategic moves, you take them. Margaret Walsh from the insurance agency was more direct. That Brad fellow came down to see me last week," she said during a casual conversation in the lobby. "He was fishing for information about you, asking how long I'd known you were the owner, whether you'd mentioned anything about your plans for the building. I told him it wasn't any of his business." The interactions with Meridian employees were awkward but infrequent. Most of them used the back entrance and avoided the main lobby where they might encounter me. The few times I did see familiar faces in the elevator or parking lot, they either pretended not to recognize me or offered uncomfortable smiles and generic pleasantries, except for Maya Rodriguez, a junior account executive who had started at Meridian about 6 months before I was fired. She had been friendly when we worked together. Someone who seemed to understand the arbitrary nature of office politics without becoming cynical about it. When she saw me in the coffee shop across the street one morning, she walked over to my table. "Sarah, I heard what happened," she said, glancing around to make sure no one from the office was nearby. "I wanted to tell you that what they did to you was wrong. Everyone knew you deserved that raise, and the way Brad handled it was completely unfair." "Thank you for saying that," I replied. "How are things at the office these days?" She grimaced. "Tense. Really tense. Brad's been in a terrible mood since the lease situation started, and it's affecting everyone. Plus, they've been trying to redistribute your old responsibilities, and it's not going well. Turns out replacing you was harder than they thought." "I'm sorry you're dealing with that. It's not fair to the rest of the team." "Are you really not going to negotiate at all? The rent increase is pretty steep, and I know they're struggling with it." I considered her question carefully. Maya had always been direct and honest, qualities I respected. "The terms I offered are fair market value for the space," I said. "If Meridian is struggling with that, It might be because they're not as profitable as they claimed to be when they were telling me I didn't deserve a raise. She nodded slowly. I get it. I really do. I just hope this doesn't end up hurting people who weren't involved in what happened to you. Her comment stayed with me for days afterward. I hadn't considered the impact on individual employees who had nothing to do with my firing. People like Maya who were just trying to do their jobs and build their careers. It was a valid concern, and one that made me examine my motivations more carefully. But every time I started to feel guilty about the situation, I remembered Brad's words about knowing my place. I remembered the condescending smile, the dismissive wave of his hand, the casual way he had destroyed my faith in merit-based advancement. I remembered walking out of that building with 2 weeks of severance pay and the knowledge that 3.5 years of excellent work had been reduced to a cultural fit problem. The truth was that Meridian's financial struggles weren't my responsibility to solve. If they couldn't afford market-rate rent for premium office space, they had the same options as any other business: find efficiencies, increase revenue, or relocate to less expensive accommodations. The fact that their predicament was caused by their former employees' success was ironic. But it wasn't unjust. 3 months into the new lease arrangement, I received a call from an unexpected source. Robert Chen, the man who had sold me the building, wanted to meet for coffee. He was curious about how the property was performing under my management and whether I might be interested in purchasing another building he was considering selling. We met at a upscale cafe downtown, and Robert turned out to be a fascinating conversationalist. He had been in commercial real estate for 40 years, had seen multiple market cycles, and had strong opinions about property management and tenant relations. "I've been hearing interesting stories about your building," he said over his second cup of green tea, "specifically about your relationship with the marketing company on the 3rd floor. What kind of stories? That you used to work for them and now you're their landlord. That there was some kind of conflict that led to the current situation." He paused. "People are saying you bought the building specifically to get revenge on your former employer. And what do you think about that?" He smiled. "I think it's brilliant. Not the revenge part, the investment part. You identified an opportunity, you had the resources to act on it, and you executed a complex real estate transaction successfully. The personal history is just an interesting footnote. Some people think it's vindictive. Some people think successful women are vindictive by definition," he replied. "The question isn't whether your actions bothered people who prefer women to be accommodating and grateful. The question is whether you made a smart business decision with your money." We talked for 2 hours about real estate investment strategies, market trends, and the psychology of commercial tenants. By the end of the conversation, I had agreed to look at another property he was selling, a smaller building with retail space on the ground floor and apartments above. The second building was in a transitioning neighborhood, the kind of area where young professionals were starting to move because they couldn't afford the trendy districts closer to downtown. The retail space was occupied by a small bookstore that had been struggling since the pandemic, and the apartments upstairs were rented to grad students and entry-level workers who valued location over luxury. I made an offer the following week. 6 months after becoming Meridian's landlord, I owned 3 commercial properties and was looking at a 4th. The rental income from my initial investment had been reinvested into additional real estate, creating a portfolio that generated passive income while appreciating in value. I had quit my job search and started treating property management as my full-time career. The work was different from marketing but equally challenging. Instead of developing campaigns to sell products, I was developing strategies to maximize property value and tenant satisfaction. Instead of managing client relationships, I was managing tenant relationships and contractor relationships and municipal relationships. The skills translated better than I had expected. I hired a part-time assistant, help with administrative tasks, and a full-time maintenance coordinator to handle repairs and tenant requests. I established relationships with reliable contractors for everything, from plumbing to landscaping. I learned about building codes and zoning regulations and tax assessments. I discovered that I enjoyed the concrete nature of real estate investment, the way you could measure success in square footage and rental rates and property values. The personal satisfaction was harder to quantify, but equally real. Every month when the rent payments arrived, every time I walked through my buildings inspecting the common areas, every time a tenant complimented me on how well maintained the properties were, I felt a sense of accomplishment that I had never experienced as an employee. I was building something that belonged to me, something that couldn't be eliminated during restructuring or dismissed as a cultural fit problem. I was creating value that I controlled, income that I had earned, and wealth that no one could take away by telling me to know my place. The relationship with Meridian settled into a professional routine. They paid their rent on time, submitted maintenance requests through proper channels, and generally avoided any unnecessary contact with me. Brad and I occasionally encountered each other in the elevator or parking lot, and these interactions were polite but distant. He would nod and say hello. I would respond in kind, and we would both go about our business without acknowledgement of our shared history. The only exception came on a rainy Tuesday in March. Almost a year after I had bought the building, I was meeting with a contractor about updating the HVAC system when Brad approached me in the lobby. "Sarah, do you have a minute?" he asked, his tone more subdued than I remembered. "What can I help you with, Brad? I wanted to talk to you about something, if you don't mind. Maybe we could grab coffee sometime this week?" I was curious despite myself. "What did you want to discuss?" He glanced around the lobby, checking to see if anyone else was nearby. "Look, I know things ended badly between us, and I've been thinking about that. About how I handled your raise request, about what happened afterward. I think maybe we could both benefit from clearing the air." "I'm not sure what there is to clear," I said. "You made a business decision based on what you thought was best for Meridian. I made a business decision based on what I thought was best for me. Everything worked out the way it was supposed to." "Did it, though? I mean, you're successful now, obviously, but don't you think this whole situation is a little unusual? You bought this building specifically because we were tenants here. That's not a normal real estate investment." I studied his face, trying to read the motivation behind his question. "Are you asking if I bought this building to spite you personally?" "I guess I am, yeah." "The answer is no, Brad. I bought this building because it was a good investment opportunity that I could afford. The fact that Meridian was a tenant here made it more interesting, but it wasn't the deciding factor." He seemed to consider this. "So if we had offered you that raise, if things had worked out different, you still would have bought the building?" "Probably not," I admitted. "If I had stayed at Meridian, I wouldn't have had the time to research real estate investments seriously. I would have kept my crypto portfolio as a long-term hold and continued working in marketing. But you didn't offer me the raise, and you did fire me, and I did have the time and motivation to explore other options." "Right," he said quietly. "So in a way, I created this situation." "You created an opportunity for me to discover something I was good at and enjoyed doing. Whether that's a situation you're comfortable with is really up to you." We stood there for a moment in the awkward silence that follows conversations about things people would prefer not to discuss. Finally, Brad cleared his throat. "For what it's worth, Sarah, I think I misjudged you back then. You were more capable than I gave you credit for, and you've proven that pretty definitively. Thank you for saying that. Does that change anything? Between us, I mean, or between Meridian and Cornerstone? It doesn't change anything about our business relationship, I said, but I appreciate the acknowledgement. He nodded and turned to walk away, then stopped. One more thing. Would you consider a longer-term lease? Maybe 5 years instead of annual renewals? We'd be willing to discuss terms if you're interested in that kind of stability. I thought about it for a moment. A longer lease would provide guaranteed income and reduce the administrative burden of annual negotiations. It would also lock in current market rates, which might work in Meridian's favor if the market continued to rise. I'll consider it, I said. Have your lawyer send me a proposal, and I'll review it with my attorney. Great. Thank you. After he left, I remained in the lobby for a few minutes, processing the conversation. Brad's acknowledgement of his mistake felt genuine, and his request for a longer lease made business sense for both parties. But I realized that his approval or recognition no longer mattered to me the way it once had. A year ago, hearing him admit that he had misjudged me would have felt like vindication, like proof that I had been right all along. Now it felt like information. Interesting, but not particularly relevant to my current situation. I had moved beyond needing his validation because I had created my own measures of success. The 5-year lease negotiation took 6 weeks and resulted in terms that benefited both parties. Meridian got rental rate stability and avoided the uncertainty of annual renewals. I got guaranteed income and the security of knowing my anchor tenant would remain in place long enough for me to plan other property improvements. By the time we signed the agreement, my portfolio had grown to include 5 buildings and generated enough monthly income to support a comfortable lifestyle without touching the principal. I had employees, professional relationships, and a reputation in the local real estate community as someone who managed properties well and dealt fairly with tenants. I had also started dating again, something I hadn't prioritized during the intense months of building my business. Through a mutual friend, I met David, a software engineer who owned his own consulting company and understood the challenges and rewards of entrepreneurship. He was impressed by my success, but not intimidated by it. A balance I hadn't expected to find. The story of how I had become Meridian's landlord was something David found amusing rather than concerning. It's like a real-life fairy tale, he said over dinner one evening. The employee who was told she didn't know her place ends up owning the place. It's not really a fairy tale, I corrected him. Fairy tales involve magic and luck. This involved research and risk management and a lot of very boring paperwork. Maybe, he said, but it's still a pretty good story. He was right, of course. It was a good story, the kind of narrative that people found satisfying because it contained elements of justice and irony and unexpected reversals of fortune. But for me, it had stopped being a story about revenge or vindication and had become simply the beginning of a different kind of career. 2 years after I bought my first building, I received an invitation to speak at a local women's business association meeting about real estate investment strategies. The audience was primarily women in their 20s and 30s who were interested in building wealth outside of traditional employment. During the question and answer session, someone asked about the Meridian situation. Is it true that you bought your first building specifically to become your former employer's landlord? She asked. That's an oversimplification of what happened, I replied. I bought the building because it was a sound investment that I could afford to make. The fact that my former employer was a tenant there made the purchase more personally meaningful, but it wasn't the primary motivation. But wasn't it satisfying to have that kind of power over people who had treated you unfairly? I considered the question carefully. The satisfaction came from succeeding at something challenging, not from having power over anyone. Real estate investment is difficult and requires significant research and risk tolerance. Building a successful property management business requires skills in maintenance, tenant relations, financial analysis, and strategic planning. The personal history with one tenant was much less important than learning to do all of those things well. So, you don't think there's anything wrong with what you did? What I did was legal, profitable, and professionally executed. Whether there's anything wrong with it depends on what you think people should do when they're fired for asking for a fair wage. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, touching on investment strategies, financing options, and the challenges women face in male-dominated industries. Afterward, several attendees approached me for additional advice or to share their own experiences with workplace discrimination and career transitions. One woman, probably in her mid-20s, waited until most of the crowd had dispersed before approaching me. "I wanted to thank you for sharing your story," she said. "I'm dealing with something similar at my job right now, and hearing about your experience gives me hope that there are other options." "What kind of situation are you dealing with?" "I work for a small tech company, and I've been asking for a promotion for 8 months. They keep telling me I'm not ready, but they promoted 2 men who started after me and have less experience. I'm starting to think it's not about readiness." "It probably isn't," I agreed. "What are your options?" "Well, I've been thinking about starting my own business, but I don't have the kind of money you had to invest in real estate." "You don't need my kind of money to start your own business. You need enough money to sustain yourself while you build something profitable, and you need a clear understanding of what value you're going to provide to customers. What kind of business are you considering?" We talked for another 15 minutes about her ideas, her skills, and her financial situation. By the end of the conversation, she had a clearer picture of what steps she needed to take to transition from employee to entrepreneur. Driving home that evening, I reflected on how my perspective on the Meridian situation had evolved. What had started as a personal response to unfair treatment had become a career change that I found more fulfilling than anything I had done as an employee. The satisfaction I derived from my work now had nothing to do with Brad Hoffman or his opinion of my ambitions. I thought about the young woman who had approached me after the presentation, and about Maya Rodriguez, who had eventually left Meridian to start her own marketing consultancy. I thought about all the people who were told to know their place, to be realistic about their expectations, to wait their turn for opportunities that might never come. The traditional advice in those situations was to work harder, be patient, and hope that merit would eventually be recognized and rewarded. But there was another option that people rarely discussed: stop waiting for permission and create your own opportunities. That realization had been worth more than any raise Meridian could have offered me. It had been worth more than Brad's eventual acknowledgement that he had misjudged me. It had been worth the risk of investing most of my savings in an unfamiliar industry. 3 years after walking out of Meridian Marketing Solutions with 2 weeks of severance pay, I owned 8 commercial properties, employed 6 people, and had a net worth that exceeded anything I could have achieved as someone else's employee. I had learned skills I hadn't known I possessed, built relationships with people I never would have met, and created something that belonged entirely to me. The building at 4047 Commerce Street remained the crown jewel of my portfolio, not because it was the most profitable or the most prestigious, but because it represented the moment when I stopped accepting other people's definitions of what I was capable of achieving. Meridian was still there on the 3rd floor, still paying their rent on time, still occupying the space with the best views in the building. Brad had been promoted to regional director and traveled frequently for work. Janet from HR had retired and been replaced by someone I didn't know. Most of the employees I had worked with had moved on to other jobs or other companies. The routine nature of our landlord-tenant relationship had become comfortable for everyone involved. I treated Meridian exactly like my other tenants, professionally, fairly, and without reference to our shared history. They submitted maintenance requests through the proper channels, paid their bills on time, and participated in building-wide communications about policy updates or scheduled improvements. But the real transformation wasn't in how they treated me. It was in how I saw myself. The woman who had sat in Brad's office 3 years ago, nervously requesting a 20% raise and preparing to negotiate down to 15%, had been operating from a position of dependence. She needed their approval, their recognition, their permission to advance her career. She had been asking them to value her contributions because she wasn't sure how to value them herself. The woman I had become didn't need anyone's permission to succeed. I had learned to evaluate my own worth based on results I could measure, properties acquired, tenants satisfied, income generated, wealth accumulated. I had created a business that functioned according to principles I understood and controlled in an industry where success was determined by mathematics rather than politics. This shift in perspective had affected every aspect of my life. When David and I discussed marriage, we talked about it as a partnership between equals rather than a traditional arrangement where one person's career took precedence. When I considered expanding my business into other markets, I made decisions based on market analysis and financial projections rather than seeking validation from advisors who might tell me to be more realistic about my goals. The confidence that came from owning something significant had changed how I moved through the world. Not in an arrogant way, I hoped, but with the quiet assurance that comes from knowing you can solve your own problems and create your own opportunities. One afternoon in late spring, I was reviewing quarterly reports in my office when my assistant knocked on the door. "There's someone here to see you," she said. "Maya Rodriguez. She says she used to work with you." Maya walked in looking more polished and confident than I remembered her. She was wearing a well-tailored blazer and carrying a leather portfolio that suggested her business was doing well. "Sarah," she said with a genuine smile, "I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced. I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd take a chance." "Of course not. Please, sit down. How's the consulting business going?" "Really well, actually. Better than I expected when I first left Meridian. I wanted to thank you for the advice you gave me about starting my own company. It made a difference." "What advice was that?" "You told me that the hardest part wasn't having enough money to start. It was having enough confidence to believe you could succeed at something you'd never done before. You were right about that." I remembered our conversation in the coffee shop, but I was surprised she had found it so meaningful. "I'm glad it was helpful. What kind of clients are you working with?" "Small to medium businesses that need marketing strategy but can't afford a full-service agency. I help them develop campaigns, manage their social media presence, analyze their customer data. It's exactly the kind of work I loved doing at Meridian, but now I get to make the strategic decisions instead of just implementing other people's ideas." "That sounds perfect for your skill set." "It is. And the timing worked out well because a lot of companies are reevaluating their marketing spend and looking for more flexible arrangements than traditional agencies can provide." We talked for another 20 minutes about her business, her clients, and the challenges of entrepreneurship. Before she left, she asked about my expansion plans and whether I had considered investing in other types of real estate. "I've been thinking about residential properties," I told her. Single-family homes in neighborhoods that are likely to appreciate over the next 5 to 10 years. The numbers look good, and it would diversify my portfolio beyond commercial real estate. Have you looked at the area near the university? I've been working with a client who develops student housing, and he says the demand is way ahead of supply. I hadn't considered student housing specifically, but that's an interesting market. Lower per unit rent, but higher occupancy rates, and the demand is relatively predictable. Exactly. Plus, if you buy properties near campus, you have the option to convert them to regular rentals if the student market changes. After Maya left, I spent the rest of the afternoon researching residential real estate near the local university. The market dynamics were different from commercial properties, but the underlying principles were the same: location, condition, cash flow potential, and long-term appreciation prospects. By the end of the week, I had contacted a residential real estate agent and scheduled appointments to view several properties. The expansion into residential real estate felt like a natural evolution of my business, another way to build wealth through strategic investment and careful management. 6 months later, I owned 3 single-family homes near the university, each divided into apartments that rented to graduate students and young professionals. The properties required more hands-on management than my commercial buildings, but they also generated higher returns and gave me experience with a different segment of the rental market. The success of my residential investments led to opportunities I hadn't anticipated. Other real estate investors in the area began approaching me about joint ventures and partnership opportunities. I was invited to speak at conferences about women in real estate and alternative investment strategies. A local business magazine featured me in an article about entrepreneurs who had built successful companies in non-traditional ways. The attention was flattering but also slightly surreal. The narrative that had developed around my story focused heavily on the revenge aspect of buying my former employer's building, which had been a relatively small part of my overall business strategy. Reporters wanted to hear about the confrontation with Brad, the satisfaction of having power over people who had wronged me, the dramatic moment when he realized who his new landlord was. But those weren't the details that mattered to me anymore. The important parts of my story were less dramatic but more substantial. The months of research before making my first investment, the systems I had developed for tenant screening and property maintenance, the financial discipline that had allowed me to reinvest profits into additional properties instead of lifestyle inflation. The Meridian situation had been the catalyst for my career change, but it hadn't been the foundation of my success. That foundation had been built through careful analysis, calculated risks, and consistent execution over time. The personal satisfaction came from mastering a complex skill set, not from settling old scores. On a quiet Sunday morning in early fall, I was reviewing maintenance schedules for all of my properties when I realized something that made me smile. I had been so focused on building my business that I had stopped thinking about Meridian as my former employer. They had become simply another tenant, no more or less important than Dr. Kim's dental practice or Margaret Walsh's insurance agency. The shift had happened gradually, so subtly that I hadn't noticed it until that moment. But somewhere along the way, I had stopped defining myself in relation to the company that had fired me and started defining myself in relation to the company I had built. That afternoon, I called my parents to update them on my latest property acquisition. My mother had initially been worried about my career change, concerned that real estate investment was too risky and that I should look for another marketing job instead. But as my business grew and stabilized, her concerns had shifted to pride in what I had accomplished. "Your father and I were just talking about how proud we are of you," she said during our conversation. Not just because you're successful, but because you found something you're passionate about and built it from the ground up. Thank you, Mom. That means a lot. Do you ever regret leaving marketing? Do you miss the creative aspects of that work? It was a good question, one I hadn't considered in a while. I don't miss being someone else's employee, I said. But I do use creative thinking in real estate. Every property is a puzzle to solve. How to maximize its potential, how to attract and retain good tenants, how to balance immediate cash flow with long-term appreciation. It's just a different kind of creativity. And you don't miss working with a team? I have a team now. It's smaller and the relationships are different, but I work with contractors, property managers, tenants, other investors. The collaboration is there. It's just structured differently. After we hung up, I thought about her questions and realized how much my relationship with work had changed. As an employee, I had been motivated primarily by external validation, raises, promotions, recognition from supervisors and colleagues. As a business owner, I was motivated by internal satisfaction, the knowledge that I was building something valuable, solving problems effectively, and creating opportunities for myself and others. The difference wasn't just psychological, it was practical. When I was an employee, my financial security depended on maintaining someone else's approval. As a business owner, my financial security depended on my ability to make good decisions and execute them successfully. The responsibility was greater, but so was the control. That evening, David and I went to dinner at a new restaurant downtown. We had been together for almost 2 years, and our relationship had developed into the kind of comfortable partnership that I hadn't thought was possible when I was focused primarily on career advancement. "I have something to tell you," he said, after we ordered. "I got an offer from a company in Seattle. It's a significant opportunity, the kind of role I've been working toward for years." I felt a familiar tightness in my chest, the anxiety that comes with unexpected change. "That's exciting. Tell me about it." "It's a senior engineering position with a startup that's developing environmental monitoring software. The salary is excellent, the equity package is substantial, and the work aligns with everything I care about, professionally. It sounds perfect for you." "It is, but it would mean relocating, and I know you've built something important here. I don't want to ask you to give up your business to follow my career." I looked at him across the table, this man who understood that my work was more than just a job, who recognized that I had created something I couldn't easily replant in another city. The consideration he was showing me was exactly what I had wanted from previous relationships, but had never found. "What if I didn't have to give up my business?" I asked. "What if I could manage it remotely while we figured out how to build something similar in Seattle? Is that possible?" "I don't know yet, but I could explore it. I have good people working for me here, and most of the day-to-day management could be handled by phone and email. I could probably fly back once a month for inspections. Major decisions." We spent the rest of dinner discussing the logistics of a potential move, the challenges and opportunities it would present, the timeline for making a decision. By the end of the evening, we had agreed that he would accept the position and I would spend the next few months developing a plan for managing my business from a distance. The prospect of relocating was daunting, but it was also energizing in a way I hadn't expected. For the past 3 years, I had been building my business in familiar territory, working with local contractors and tenants and market conditions I understood. Managing properties from another state would require new systems, new relationships, and new levels of trust in the people I employed. It would also provide an opportunity to explore real estate markets in the Pacific Northwest, to learn about different regulatory environments and demographic trends. If I could successfully manage my existing portfolio remotely, I might be able to replicate my success in Seattle. 2 weeks after David accepted the job offer, I flew to Seattle to spend a long weekend exploring the city and researching its real estate market. The trip was part vacation, part reconnaissance mission, and part test of whether I could imagine building a life there. The city exceeded my expectations in almost every way. The neighborhoods were diverse and interesting, the economy was strong and growing, and the real estate market showed signs of long-term appreciation potential. I spent hours walking through different areas, noting the types of properties available, the rental rates being advertised, the demographic mix of residents. On my last day in Seattle, I toured 3 commercial buildings that were for sale. None of them were right for immediate purchase, but the exercise helped me understand local market conditions and pricing structures. I also met with 2 property management companies that specialized in working with out-of-state investors. Flying back to my home city, I felt the same excitement I had experienced before buying my first building. The combination of new challenges and familiar principles, the opportunity to test my skills in different circumstances, the potential for building something even larger than what I had already created. Over the next month, I developed a comprehensive plan for managing my existing properties remotely. I promoted my maintenance coordinator to general manager, giving him authority to handle day-to-day operations and emergency situations. I established protocols for regular communication, monthly financial reports, and quarterly in-person visits. I created systems for remote tenant screening, electronic lease signing, and digital payment processing. The transition wasn't seamless, but it was manageable. My Seattle move became an experiment in business scalability, a test of whether the systems I had developed could function without my constant oversight. By the time David and I relocated to Seattle in the spring, I was successfully managing my original portfolio from across the country and actively researching investment opportunities in my new city. The business I had started as a response to being fired had evolved into something much larger and more sophisticated than I had originally imagined. On our first morning in our new apartment, I stood at the window looking out at the Seattle skyline and thought about how far I had traveled from that conference room where Brad had told me to know my place, not just geographically, but psychologically and professionally. The woman who had asked for a raise 3 years ago had been seeking permission to advance within someone else's organization. The woman standing at the window was planning to build her own organization in a new market, using skills and resources she had developed independently. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been driven primarily by anger or revenge. It had been driven by curiosity about what was possible when you stopped accepting other people's limitations as your own. 6 months after moving to Seattle, I purchased my first building in the Pacific Northwest, a small apartment complex in a neighborhood that was attracting young professionals and graduate students. The acquisition process was more complex than my previous purchases, involving different regulations and market conditions, but the fundamental analysis was the same. By the end of my first year in Seattle, I owned property in 2 states and was managing a business that generated more income than I had ever earned as an employee. I had also started exploring other investment opportunities. A small stake in David's startup, shares in a real estate investment trust that focused on sustainable development, and a diversified stock portfolio that balanced growth potential with steady dividends. The financial security I had built gave me freedom to make choices based on what I wanted to do, rather than what I needed to do to pay bills. When a national business magazine asked me to write an article about women in real estate investment, I accepted because the topic interested me, not because I needed the exposure. When a local nonprofit asked me to serve on their board, I agreed because I cared about their mission, not because it would benefit my business. The article I wrote for the business magazine focused on practical strategies for getting started in real estate investment, how to research markets, evaluate properties, secure financing, and manage CRO. Tenants. I mentioned my background as a marketing professional and my transition to entrepreneurship, but I didn't emphasize the Meridian story that had become so central to how other people understood my career change. The response to the article was overwhelmingly positive. I received emails from women across the country who were considering similar career transitions, asking for advice about everything from finding the right real estate agent to calculating cash flow projections. Several mentioned that they had been inspired by stories about my revenge on my former employer, but most were more interested in the technical aspects of building a successful real estate business. One email particularly stood out. It was from a woman named Jennifer who worked in pharmaceutical sales and was considering investing in rental properties. She wrote, "I've read several articles about your story, and while the part about your former employer is interesting, what really impressed me is how you built a business that generates passive income and allows you to work from anywhere. That's the kind of financial independence I want to create for myself." Her email crystallized something I had been thinking about for months. The narrative that had developed around my career change focused heavily on the dramatic elements: the firing, the secret property purchase, the moment of revelation when Brad discovered his new landlord's identity. But those weren't the elements that had created lasting value in my life. The lasting value had come from learning to evaluate opportunities independently, developing systems for managing complex projects, building relationships with reliable partners, and creating multiple streams of income that didn't depend on any single employer or client. Those skills were transferable to any number of business ventures, not just real estate investment. They represented a way of thinking about work and money and security that was fundamentally different from the employee mindset I had carried for most of my adult life. As my second year in Seattle began, I started mentoring other women who were interested in real estate investment. Not through any formal program, but through informal conversations at networking events, coffee meetings with friends of friends, and responses to the emails I continued to receive after speaking engagements. The mentoring relationships were mutually beneficial. Helping other people think through their investment strategies forced me to articulate principles I had learned intuitively, and hearing about their challenges reminded me of obstacles I had forgotten about. Overcoming. One woman I worked with, Sandra, had been a corporate lawyer for 15 years and wanted to transition into property development. She had significant savings and excellent analytical skills, but she was struggling with the psychological shift from being someone else's highly compensated employee to being her own moderately compensated entrepreneur. "I keep second-guessing myself," she told me during one of our meetings. "In law, I knew exactly what was expected of me and how to measure success. In real estate, there are so many variables I can't control, and I'm not sure I'm making the right decisions." That uncertainty never completely goes away, I told her. But you learn to make decisions with incomplete information and adjust as you get new data. The key is having a clear framework for evaluation and sticking to it consistently. What's your framework? Location, condition, cash flow potential, and long-term appreciation prospects. I research each of those factors thoroughly, but I don't wait until I have perfect information about all of them. Perfect information doesn't exist in real estate, just like it doesn't exist in law. But in law, I have precedents and statutes and established procedures. In real estate, every property is different. Every legal case is different too, I pointed out. You use the same analytical process to evaluate different fact patterns. Real estate investment is similar. The principles are consistent even when the specific circumstances change. Our conversation continued for another hour, covering everything from financing strategies to tenant screening procedures. By the end of the meeting, Sandra seemed more confident about her ability to transition from employee to entrepreneur. 6 months later, she purchased her first investment property, a duplex in a neighborhood that was undergoing gentrification. The property needed significant renovation, but Sandra had calculated that the post-renovation value would justify the investment. She managed the renovation project herself, learning construction management skills that would serve her well in future developments. Watching Sandra succeed at something she had initially found intimidating reminded me of my own journey from marketing professional to real estate investor. The specific industry knowledge had been learnable, but the confidence to trust my own judgment had been the more challenging transformation. That confidence had been built through small successes that proved I could navigate unfamiliar territory, solve complex problems, and create value through strategic thinking and careful execution. Each property I purchased, each tenant relationship I managed successfully, each renovation project I completed on time and under budget had contributed to a growing sense of competence that no employer could take away. 3 years after moving to Seattle, I owned 12 properties across 2 states and was considering expansion into a third market. My business generated enough passive income to support a comfortable lifestyle without requiring me to work more than 20 hours per week on active management. The rest of my time was spent on activities I found personally fulfilling: mentoring other investors, writing about real estate strategies, serving on nonprofit boards, and exploring new business opportunities with David, whose startup had been acquired by a larger company in a deal that provided him with significant financial security. Our relationship had deepened through the challenges of building careers in a new city, managing long-distance business operations, and supporting each other through the uncertainties of entrepreneurship. We had learned to function as true partners, each bringing different skills and perspectives to shared goals. On a clear Saturday morning in late summer, David and I were hiking on a trail with views of Mount Rainier when he stopped at a scenic overlook and pulled out a ring. The proposal was simple and heartfelt, focusing on the partnership we had already built and the future we wanted to create together. I said yes without hesitation, not because I needed marriage to feel complete, but because I wanted to formalize a relationship that had already proven itself through practical challenges and shared successes. That evening, we called our families to share the news. My parents were delighted, and my mother asked when we were planning the wedding and whether we had thought about where we wanted to live long term. "We're thinking about staying in Seattle," I told her. "My business is established here now, and David's career opportunities are excellent, but we might spend part of the year in other places. One advantage of the work we do is that it's not tied to a specific location." "That sounds wonderful," she said. "Your father and I are so proud of how you've built this life for yourself. When you first left that marketing job, we weren't sure what you were doing, but it's turned out better than we could have imagined." After we hung up, I thought about her comment and realized how different my life had become from what I had originally planned. As a marketing professional, I had expected to advance through corporate hierarchies, accumulating titles and salaries and retirement benefits according to a predictable timeline. Instead, I had created something that was entirely my own. A business that reflected my values, a career that provided both financial security and personal fulfillment, and a lifestyle that allowed me to make choices based on what I wanted rather than what I needed. The transformation had begun with being fired for asking for a raise, but it had evolved into something much more significant than revenge against a former employer. It had become a complete reimagining of what work could be and how wealth could be built. Standing on our apartment balcony that night, looking out at the city lights and thinking about the properties I owned, the tenants whose lives I impacted positively, and the business I had built from nothing, I felt a satisfaction that was deeper and more lasting than any promotion or raise could have provided. I had learned to create my own opportunities instead of waiting for them to be offered. I had learned to measure success by my own standards instead of seeking validation from others. Most importantly, I had learned that knowing your place wasn't about accepting limitations imposed by other people. It was about understanding your own capabilities and refusing to let anyone else define them. The building at 4047 Commerce Street still housed Meridian Marketing Solutions on its third floor, and they still paid their rent on time every month. But that building had become just one asset in a portfolio that spanned multiple states and represented the foundation of genuine financial independence. Brad Hoffman was still the regional director there, still traveling frequently for work, still probably telling ambitious employees to be realistic about their expectations. But his opinion of my capabilities had become irrelevant to my success, just as his approval had become unnecessary for my happiness. The real victory hadn't been becoming his landlord, it had been becoming someone who no longer needed his permission to succeed.